The pilot's hand trembled slightly as Hans Vera Leischer made the first entry in his logbook, noting an event that would drastically change the Luftwaffe's understanding of their enemy. The Americans couldn't have possibly built thousands of these machines. No nation could manufacture such complexity on an industrial scale while also fighting a global war. Through the cockpit window of the captured Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, coded DL+XXC by German forces, Leischer studied the instrument panel, which contradicted 3 years of Luftwaffe intelligence assessments. 13 defensive gun positions would eventually surround the more advanced models of this aircraft. The B-17 model in front of him carried 9 heavy-caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, creating a web of fire that transformed the bomber into something unprecedented in aerial warfare. In German hands, this captured fortress, nicknamed Wolfhound, represented the first intact American heavy bomber the Luftwaffe would test fly. What Leischer and his fellow test pilots would discover in the coming months would prove more damaging to German morale than any battlefield defeat. The firepower concentrated in this one aircraft, when replicated across hundreds of bombers flying in defensive formations, would create a level of aerial combat capability German fighter pilots had never encountered, and German industry could never match. The transformation of this enemy weapon into an intelligence treasure began 3 months earlier, on December 12, 1942. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger piloted B-17F, serial number 41-4585, callsign Pub, during a bombing run against the Rouen-Sotteville Railroad marshalling yards in occupied France. His aircraft, part of the 361st Bombardment Squadron of the 303rd Bombardment Group stationed at Riaf, Molesworth, England, carried the unofficial name Wolfhound, painted on its nose by the American ground crew. The 3003rd Bomb Group, known as the Hells Angels, had only recently seen combat, lacking much battlefield experience. On that December morning, they supplied 20 B-17s for a mission targeting Luftwaffe servicing facilities about 60 miles east of Paris. The mission began like any other, but German fighters from multiple Luftwaffe units had different plans. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Foch, Wolf FW-190s aggressively attacked the American formation. The German pilots pressed their attacks relentlessly, understanding that disrupting the tight formations gave them the best chance of success. Machine gun and cannon fire tore through Wolfhound's fuselage and wings. One engine sputtered and died, its propeller windmilling uselessly. Another lost power, smoke trailing from damaged cylinders. Flickinger faced an impossible decision as his crippled bomber fell behind the formation. The other B-17s continued towards England, unable to slow down without making themselves easy targets for the pursuing German fighters. Heading toward England meant certain death for the damaged bomber. Flying to neutral Switzerland or Sweden would involve hundreds of miles over enemy territory with failing engines and pursuing fighters. The only viable option for survival was an emergency landing on enemy-controlled soil. Flickinger spotted what appeared to be a suitable field near Melun, France, about 60 miles southeast of Paris. Despite the damage to his aircraft, he skillfully brought the massive 30-ton bomber down for a belly landing in a hayfield. The bomber skidded across the grass and mud, its ball turret guns pointing downward, before coming to a stop. The 10-man crew emerged from the aircraft with their hands raised, expecting to be taken prisoner. What they didn't expect was how valuable their intact aircraft would become to German intelligence. Within hours, Luftwaffe ground crews and Wehrmacht soldiers swarmed the captured fortress. Engineers photographed every system, every structural detail, and every technological feature to prevent damage from souvenir hunters or sabotage. This wasn't just another downed Allied aircraft to be stripped for parts. Wolfhound was the first B-17 Flying Fortress to fall into German hands in flyable condition, making it an intelligence goldmine. The bomber represented a rare opportunity to study American heavy bomber design, construction methods, defensive armament, and operational capabilities. The German recovery specialists immediately recognized the value of this prize. Most downed Allied aircraft arrived in pieces, scattered across fields and forests. But Wolfhound sat nearly intact, a complete example of American heavy bomber technology ready to be exploited. German technicians quickly transported the damaged but repairable bomber to Leeuwarden Airfield in the Netherlands, a major Luftwaffe base. The process required careful planning to avoid further damage to the bomber. 2 days after capture, on December 14, 1942, German mechanics completed temporary repairs to the battle damage. The bomber was refueled with German aviation gasoline, and its American markings were replaced with German national insignia, including large black crosses on the wings and a swastika on the tail. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109 heavy fighters provided escort, and a handpicked German crew boarded the bomber for the ferry flight to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier testing and evaluation center, located about 50 miles north of Berlin. The flight plan was distributed to every Luftwaffe fighter base and flak battery along the route, with instructions not to engage the captured bomber. But despite these precautions and the clear German markings, some Luftwaffe units fired on their own captured prize, causing minor additional damage before recognizing the aircraft and calling off their attack. When Wolfhound finally touched down at Rechlin, it entered a world dedicated to studying enemy technology. Rechlin was the central Luftwaffe testing facility, similar to the United States Wright Field in Ohio or the British Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Here, engineers dissected every foreign aircraft that could be repaired to flying condition, searching for weaknesses to exploit or innovations to copy or counter. For 3 months after its arrival in mid-December 1942, Wolfhound remained grounded as specialists conducted exhaustive examinations. Engineers removed panels to study its structural design, marveling at the sophisticated stressed skin construction that gave the B-17 its legendary toughness. They measured skin thickness, analyzed alloy compositions, tested rivet patterns, and compared the aircraft's features to equivalent German systems. The bomber's electrical network, hydraulic controls, oxygen distribution system, intercom system, and fuel management system were all meticulously studied and documented. Luftwaffe engineers were amazed by American manufacturing techniques revealed in the B-17's construction. The bomber demonstrated mass production techniques on a scale that German industry had never attempted. Standardized components meant parts manufactured at different factories would fit together seamlessly. This level of efficiency allowed skilled workers to assemble complex aircraft quickly. This contrasted with the German approach, where skilled craftsmen were needed for fitting components through labor-intensive processes. Everything about Wolfhound's design reflected an industrial philosophy that was radically different from German practice, and this discovery would change the course of German understanding of American aircraft and industry forever. The implications of Wolfhound's capabilities were staggering for German planners, especially those familiar with industrial production. If one captured bomber could exhibit this level of manufacturing sophistication, suggesting an industrial system optimized for mass production, the question became, how many could American industry produce in a month, or even a year? When German intelligence analysts crunched the numbers, they found production rates that seemed nearly impossible, yet the calculations proved conservative. On March 17, 1943, Wolfhound took to the skies for its first flight under Luftwaffe control. Fluchto Führer, an experienced Luftwaffe test pilot chosen for his skill and judgment, conducted the maiden flight from Rechlin. The bomber handled surprisingly smoothly for such a large aircraft, responding to control inputs with unexpected ease. American pilots had praised the B-17's flight characteristics in reports intercepted by German intelligence or obtained through prisoner interrogations. German test pilots quickly confirmed these assessments through first-hand experience. The B-17 flew with remarkable stability. Despite its weight of 15 tons empty and up to 30 tons fully loaded. Even when one or two engines were shut down during tests, the bomber still maintained controllable flight, which explained why so many damaged B-17s were able to make it back to England after taking heavy combat damage that would have destroyed German bombers. In the following weeks, German pilots conducted a variety of tests to assess Wolfhound's performance. High-altitude evaluations revealed the bomber could operate comfortably above 25,000 feet, where German anti-aircraft fire became less effective due to reduced projectile velocity and longer flight times. Tests on engine synchronization showed advanced propeller control systems, including constant speed propellers and automated governors that reduced pilot workload and maintained engine performance across different flight conditions. Formation flying exercises demonstrated the bomber's stability when flying in close formation, which explained how American crews managed those tight box formations that German fighters found so difficult to penetrate. However, the most critical tests for German fighter tactics focused on the bomber's defensive armament. Understanding the B-17's weapons system became the highest priority for Luftwaffe tactical planners across all fighter units in the West. Every German fighter pilot needed to know the B-17's blind spots, the angles that offered the best chance of survival, and the distances at which German cannons could strike without entering the bomber's lethal range of machine guns. The numbers alone were sobering for German planners. The B-17F model was equipped with 9 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, positioned to cover almost every angle a fighter might use to attack. Later models like the B-77G would increase the number of guns to 13, adding a chin turret and improved nose armament. Even the B-77F's 9 heavy machine guns represented far more firepower than anything found on German bombers, which typically had smaller and less effective defensive guns. German bombers like the Heinkel He-111 or the Junkers Ju-88 had 6 or 7 machine guns, many of them rifle caliber 7.92 mm weapons with limited effectiveness against attacking fighters. In comparison, the B-17F carried 9 50 caliber heavy machine guns, each capable of penetrating armor, destroying engines, and killing pilots from ranges exceeding 600 yards. The 50 caliber rounds fired by these guns carried 3 times the kinetic energy of German 7.92 mm rounds and were comparable in power to German 13 mm heavy machine guns. Hans Vera Leischer, who would later become the most experienced test pilot of captured Allied aircraft during the war, flew Wolfhound extensively during the spring and summer of 1943. His post-war memoir, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II, provides detailed accounts of his experiences with the bomber, as well as numerous other Allied aircraft. Leischer approached captured aircraft with a scientific curiosity rather than ideological prejudice, making him an invaluable asset to the Luftwaffe's evaluation program. His engineering background and exceptional flying ability, honed through years of glider and powered aircraft experience, made him ideally suited for the dangerous and demanding job of test flying enemy planes. He flew over 125 different aircraft types during the war, all without a single serious crash or damage incident, an impressive safety record that underscored his technical skill and careful methodology. When Leischer climbed into Wolfhound's cockpit for his first flight, there were no instruction manuals, no training programs, and no qualified instructors to guide him. He learned by observation and experimentation, studying the controls and instruments, making educated guesses about their function, and carefully testing his assumptions at altitude, where mistakes wouldn't be immediately fatal. The instrument layout in the B-17 was significantly different from German aircraft, both in arrangement and philosophy. American designers favored centralized panels with standardized gauge positions, which made it easier for pilots to switch between different aircraft types. Circuit breakers replaced fuses, allowing for resettable protection that simplified troubleshooting and maintenance. Hydraulic pressure indicators were calibrated in pounds per square inch, rather than kilograms per square centimeter. The throttle quadrant also operated with reversed logic compared to German aircraft, with forward motion increasing power, instead of decreasing it. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of the B-17 to Lurser was the bomber's sheer robustness and damage tolerance. The B-17 could absorb punishment that would have destroyed German bombers, continuing to fly and fight after sustaining damage that seemed unrepairable. The aircraft's strength came from heavy, gauge aluminum alloy frames and stressed skin construction that efficiently distributed loads across the entire airframe. The B-17 featured multiple redundant systems, so a single failure rarely proved catastrophic. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires from small-caliber hits, an advanced technology the Germans understood but never implemented as comprehensively. Armor plating protected critical crew positions and vital systems, with particular attention paid to the pilots, engines, and fuel system. Lurser and other test pilots at Rechlin conducted numerous firing tests to understand the bomber's defensive capabilities from the perspective of attacking fighters. German fighter pilots simulated attack runs on Wolfhound while it flew straight and level or performed evasive maneuvers. These exercises revealed some uncomfortable truths that contradicted pre-war assumptions about bomber vulnerability. The traditional German method of attacking bombers from directly behind, which had worked against earlier Allied bombers, exposed the fighter pilot to the most concentrated defensive fire from the B-17. The tail gunner, stationed in a powered Cheyenne turret, had a clear line of fire with no blind spots within 30 drivers of the tail axis. The dorsal turret could rotate to add more firepower, and even the waist gunners could engage targets approaching from behind. A fighter pilot attacking from directly behind faced at least 4 heavy machine guns trained on the bomber, with the tail gunner alone bringing 2 guns to bear. If the range was right and the tail gunner was skilled, his fire could be devastating. This defensive arrangement created a wall of fire that German pilots found psychologically overwhelming, especially when 1 in every 4 or 5 rounds, fired by the bomber's machine guns, was a tracer, illuminating the fighter's approach. German pilots quickly learned that attacking from beneath or from the sides also posed significant challenges, as the bomber's belly turret and waist gunners created interlocking fields of fire that reduced their chances of success. Through testing and experience, the Luftwaffe's tactical planners developed a strategy involving frontal attacks, approaching the bomber head on from above. This minimized exposure time to defensive fire and targeted the bomber's weaker points, particularly the nose, which was less heavily armed than the rest of the aircraft. Early B-17 models, like the F variant that Wolfhound represented, had only 2 or 3 flexible guns in the nose, operated by the bombardier and navigator, who were not primarily trained as gunners. However, frontal attacks required exceptional skill and nerve. The fighter pilot had to fly directly toward the bomber, closing at speeds exceeding 500 mph, and wait until the range was reduced to less than 200 yards before firing. This tactic worked when executed properly, but the psychological pressure on the attacking pilot was immense, and any hesitation could result in wasted ammunition or even a collision. Despite the risks, skilled German pilots who mastered the head on pass achieved impressive kill ratios. But the tactic required precision timing and spatial awareness, and even successful frontal attacks often resulted in fatal collisions or a doomed pilot unable to break away in time. The B-17's toughness allowed it to endure tremendous damage and still stay in the fight, making it a formidable opponent for German fighters. The Luftwaffe officers' encounter with the B-17 Flying Fortress during World War II marked a significant moment in aviation history, The B-17, developed by the Boeing Company, was an advanced, heavily armed four-engine bomber designed for long-range strategic missions. Its robust design, which included up to 13 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns strategically placed around the aircraft, made it a formidable opponent in the skies. The idea behind the B-17's design was not only to deliver bombs accurately, but also to protect itself from enemy fighters, a concept that was revolutionary at the time. For Luftwaffe pilots, the B-17 was both a puzzle and a nightmare. The German Air Force, known for its highly skilled pilots and advanced aircraft, had come to rely on speed, maneuverability, and firepower in their aircraft. However, the B-17 was a different kind of enemy. It wasn't just a single aircraft, but part of a larger formation of bombers that flew in tight formations, providing mutual protection through concentrated defensive fire. The B-17's design, which included a comprehensive system of defensive armament, was a direct response to the increasing number of Luftwaffe fighters that were targeting Allied bombers during daylight raids over Europe. The first notable experience of Luftwaffe officers flying a captured B-17 came after the Allies had begun to press their offensive against Germany. As part of their strategy, they would often target the Luftwaffe's own training programs, hoping to give their pilots a better understanding of the enemy's tactics and equipment. During one such mission, a group of Luftwaffe officers had the opportunity to fly a captured B-17, and what they discovered was remarkable. They had never before encountered such an impressive level of defensive firepower. When the Luftwaffe officers first boarded the B-17, they were initially skeptical. The bomber appeared large and cumbersome compared to the sleek, nimble German fighters. The B-17's wingspan, which was over 100 feet, seemed like a vulnerable target to the untrained eye. However, it was only when they took to the air and flew alongside the B-17 that they fully appreciated the sheer effectiveness of its defensive capabilities. The bomber's armament was a key factor in this realization. With multiple machine guns aimed at different sectors of the aircraft, the B-17 could defend itself against enemy aircraft coming from almost any direction. The Luftwaffe officers, flying in close formation with the B-17, realized just how difficult it was to approach the bomber without facing heavy fire. They noted how the bombers flew in tight formations, providing overlapping fields of fire, and how this tactic made it incredibly difficult for individual German fighters to pick off a B-17 without drawing fire from multiple defensive positions. Perhaps the most striking aspect of their experience was the realization that they had never faced anything quite like it. The Germans had developed formidable aircraft of their own, including the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Foch Wolf W190, both of which were excellent dogfighters. These aircraft were fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed, making them ideal for attacking enemy bombers. However, the B-17's defensive firepower and the skillful tactics of its crews meant that a direct assault was often suicidal. Luftwaffe pilots had been accustomed to fighting bombers that were vulnerable to their firepower, but the B-17, with its formidable guns and tight formations, proved to be a far tougher opponent than they had anticipated. After the flight, the Luftwaffe officers admitted that they had never encountered such an aggressive and effective defense from a bomber. They were astonished at the bomber's ability to protect itself, even without the benefit of fighter escorts, which were often unavailable during the early days of the war. While German bombers were also heavily armed, none had the same level of defensive armament as the B-17. This realization would significantly impact the way the Luftwaffe approached bombing missions in the future. The B-17's firepower was not just an impressive feature in theory. It had real, world implications. During daylight bombing raids over Europe, B-17s often had to contend with massive formations of German fighters. The bombers' ability to defend themselves effectively made them a much more dangerous target than they had appeared to be. The Luftwaffe had initially underestimated the threat posed by the B-17. But their encounter with the captured bomber made it clear that the Americans had designed a weapon that was capable of fighting back fiercely. The experience of the Luftwaffe officers flying a B-17 also shed light on the ongoing struggle for air superiority in World War II. For much of the war, the Luftwaffe had been the dominant air force in Europe, but the arrival of the B-17 and other Allied bombers signaled a shift in the balance of power. The Allies had recognized that in order to effectively carry out strategic bombing campaigns, their bombers needed to be able to defend themselves. This shift in tactics and technology would play a pivotal role in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. In the years that followed, the Luftwaffe would continue to face the challenge of dealing with the B-17 and its impressive defensive firepower. As the war dragged on, the Germans found themselves outmatched not only by the B-17's armament, but also by the sheer number of bombers that the Allies were able to produce. The effectiveness of the B-17's defense was a key factor in the success of Allied bombing campaigns, which were aimed at crippling Germany's war economy and industrial base. The B-17's defensive armament was not the only factor that made it a formidable adversary. The aircraft's design also made it resilient in combat. Even when hit by enemy fire, the B-17 was often able to continue flying, sometimes for hundreds of miles, before eventually making a safe landing. This durability was a critical factor in its success during the war. Many B-17s returned to base with extensive damage, but their ability to stay in the fight and deliver their payload was a testament to the strength of their design. The Luftwaffe officers who flew the captured B-17 would never forget the experience. It was a stark reminder of the changing nature of warfare and the increasing importance of technological innovation. The B-17, with its advanced armament and resilient design, was a symbol of the Allied forces' commitment to air superiority. Its impact on the Luftwaffe was profound, and it would go on to play a critical role in the Allied victory in Europe. As the war progressed, the Luftwaffe would face increasingly difficult challenges in countering the effectiveness of Allied bombers like the B-17. Despite their best efforts, the Germans could never replicate the same level of defensive firepower that the B-17 possessed. The encounter between the Luftwaffe officers and the B-17 highlighted a key moment in the evolution of air combat and the technological arms race that defined much of World War II. The B-17 Flying Fortress would ultimately become one of the most iconic aircraft of the war, not only for its ability to deliver devastating bombs, but also for its role in demonstrating the power of effective self-defense in air warfare. The Luftwaffe officers' experience with the B-17 was a humbling one, as they realized just how far ahead the Allies had advanced in bomber technology. The B-17's design philosophy was rooted in the concept of the aircraft being able to survive in hostile environments. The concept of self-defense was central to its creation, as it was intended to fly long distances over enemy territory, with bombers flying in formations to increase their chances of completing their mission. This was necessary because, as the Allies' daylight bombing strategy progressed, they found that enemy interceptors would often target their bombers. As a result, there needed to be a way to defend against attacks from multiple directions at once. The bomber was designed with multiple machine gun positions located all over the aircraft, creating a web of overlapping defensive fire. It was not just about putting guns on the plane. It was about positioning them strategically so that the bomber could fend off attackers from any angle. The B-17 was equipped with nose, tail, top, and bottom turrets, and also had waist guns for side protection. This allowed the B-17 to create a defensive perimeter that could ward off attacking fighters trying to close in from any direction. The Luftwaffe pilots who flew the captured B-17 quickly realized the inherent challenge of approaching such an aircraft. Typically, in aerial combat, The primary goal was to outmaneuver the opponent, get behind them, and take them down. However, with the B-17's extensive array of machine guns and the coordinated defense tactics employed by its crew, this strategy became far more difficult. German pilots, used to engaging bombers with minimal resistance, soon found that the B-17 was not as vulnerable as they had anticipated. As they tried to close in on the bomber, they were met with a constant barrage of fire from multiple gun positions, making it difficult to get into a favorable position to attack. Additionally, the training that B-17 crews underwent made them incredibly effective at coordinating the bomber's defensive firepower. Crews were trained to operate the aircraft's guns in unison, creating a network of fire that covered the entire bomber. The B-17 also employed a technique called combat box formation, where bombers would fly in tight formations to maximize their mutual protection. Each bomber in the formation would protect the others, ensuring that if one bomber was attacked, its defenders could rely on the surrounding aircraft for assistance. This tactic made it difficult for German fighters to pick off a single bomber without exposing themselves to a concentrated counterattack from multiple B-17s. In contrast, the Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to focus on attacking from specific angles, often with high-speed strafing runs or diving attacks. They had been accustomed to the vulnerability of the British bombers, which lacked the B-17's defensive capabilities. And so the prospect of facing a bomber that could defend itself so effectively was jarring. The defensive capabilities of the B-17 were so advanced that even experienced Luftwaffe officers admitted they had never encountered anything like it before. The high velocity and sheer volume of fire coming from a single B-17 were enough to make it a challenging adversary in the skies. The realization that they had underestimated the B-17 forced Luftwaffe officers to reconsider their tactics. They had long relied on a strategy of overwhelming enemy bombers with superior numbers and firepower. However, the B-17's defensive strength, particularly in coordinated formations, made this tactic less effective. The Germans would have to find new ways to counter the bombers, which led to the development of new tactics, such as attacking in larger, more coordinated formations themselves. These new tactics were born out of the recognition that taking down a B-17 was no longer just a matter of speed and firepower. It was about outsmarting the bomber's defensive capabilities and finding a way to get through the network of fire. The Luftwaffe's realization of the B-17's superiority in self-defense also highlighted a critical gap in their own bomber designs. German bombers, such as the Heinkel He-111 and the Junkers Ju-88, were fast and efficient but lacked the same kind of defensive firepower as the B-17. German bombers relied more heavily on fighter escorts for protection, while the B-17 could take to the skies with minimal reliance on external defense. This difference in design philosophy became one of the key factors in the growing frustration of the Luftwaffe in trying to counter the Allied bombing campaigns. The inability of German bombers to replicate the same level of self-defense meant that they were often much more vulnerable to enemy fighters, particularly when operating without the protection of their own escort fighters. The B-17's defensive firepower also influenced the way air combat tactics were taught on both sides. While the Luftwaffe pilots were well versed in attacking bombers, they now had to contend with bombers that could fight back just as effectively. This led to an increased emphasis on tactics like the hit and run approach, where Luftwaffe fighters would attempt to disrupt bomber formations from a distance rather than engage them directly. This new strategy required more coordination and precision, as it was no longer enough to simply rely on speed and firepower to bring down an enemy bomber. On the Allied side, the B-17's defensive firepower became a key selling point in recruiting new airmen. The bomber's resilience in the face of enemy attacks became a symbol of the strength and determination of the Allied forces. crews began to see their aircraft as not just bombers, but as vehicles capable of defending themselves and completing their missions, even under intense pressure. The psychological impact of the B-17's defenses also helped improve morale among Allied forces, as the bomber became a symbol of the Allies' ability to strike back against the Axis. The experience of the Luftwaffe officers in flying the captured B-17 was a moment of both awe and disbelief. They had entered the mission thinking they would encounter yet another vulnerable bomber, only to be confronted with a highly effective, armed adversary that could hold its ground against their best efforts. This encounter demonstrated just how much the Allies had invested in technological innovation and strategy, giving them a decisive advantage in the skies over Europe. The realization that the B-17's defensive capabilities were a game changer in the aerial battlefield forever altered the Luftwaffe's approach to bombing raids and, more broadly, the dynamics of World War II air combat. The lessons learned by the Luftwaffe pilots during this experience would play a significant role in shaping the evolution of air combat tactics, as both the Allies and the Axis sought to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its unprecedented defensive firepower, would become one of the most iconic and influential aircraft of the war, symbolizing the shift toward more heavily armed bombers capable of defending themselves in hostile airspace. The Luftwaffe's early successes in the war, particularly in the Battle of France and during the Battle of Britain, had given the German Air Force a significant psychological advantage. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated its superiority in terms of tactics, training, and the effectiveness of its aircraft. German fighters such as the Bf-109 and the Fubla-190 were regarded as some of the best in the world, and the Luftwaffe's pilots were highly skilled in engaging Allied bombers. However, the B-17 posed an entirely new challenge. When the Germans first encountered the B-17 Flying Fortress in large numbers, they had not fully grasped the degree to which the aircraft had been engineered to withstand and retaliate against aerial threats. The strategic shift that came with the introduction of the B-17 was not immediately apparent to the Luftwaffe. For the German pilots, the idea of a bomber that could effectively defend itself was foreign. Bombers had always been regarded as vulnerable targets that could be brought down with relative ease. This was true for earlier bombers like the British Wellington and the American B-24 Liberator, which were far less capable of defending themselves. The B-17, however, broke this mold. Its design emphasized not just offensive capabilities, but also defensive resilience, making it a far more formidable adversary than any bomber the Luftwaffe had previously faced. What made the B-17 particularly effective was its range of defensive armament. The bomber was equipped with a total of 13 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, which were positioned at the nose, tail, top, and bottom turrets and the waist positions. These guns were capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute, creating a near impenetrable barrier of fire around the aircraft. The B-17 could effectively fend off attackers from almost any direction, a factor that gave it a significant edge over other bombers, which relied on more limited defensive armament. The Luftwaffe pilots were especially shocked by the coordinated fire from multiple B-17s flying in formation. While German bombers tended to fly alone or in loose formations, the B-17s flew in tight, organized groups. This was known as the combat box formation. The tactical advantage of this formation was immense. Each bomber in the formation could cover the others with its defensive firepower, making it incredibly difficult for German fighters to single out one B-17 for an attack without risking exposure to concentrated fire from several others. This was a major departure from the way Luftwaffe pilots had traditionally approached bombing missions, and they soon realized that attacking a B-17 formation was far more dangerous than they had initially thought. During the early years of the war, German fighters had been able to operate relatively freely over Europe, as Allied bombers lacked effective means of self-defense. The introduction of the B-17 changed this dynamic. The Germans, who had relied on their fighters' speed and maneuverability to overwhelm enemy bombers, now had to contend with a new reality. The B-17 was a highly capable defensive weapon in its own right. Instead of just evading enemy fire, the B-17 was able to return fire with deadly precision, forcing Luftwaffe pilots to reconsider their tactics when attacking these bombers. In addition to its firepower, the B-17 was also incredibly durable. It was built with the intention of surviving hostile encounters. Even when hit by enemy fire, the B-17 had the ability to absorb significant damage and still complete its mission. Many B-17s returned to base with parts of their fuselage and wings riddled with bullet holes, yet they were still able to land safely. This resilience was not only a testament to the aircraft's design, but also to the capabilities of the crew operating it. The crew members, who underwent extensive training, were highly skilled in maintaining control of the bomber under fire, allowing them to keep the aircraft in the air, despite serious damage. The Luftwaffe pilots' experience with the B-17 was not just a technical realization, it was also a psychological one. The Germans had come to view the B-17 as a symbol of the changing nature of air combat. No longer could they rely solely on their superior speed and agility. Now, the emphasis had shifted toward overwhelming firepower and coordinated defense, strategies that they would later attempt to emulate in their own aircraft designs. However, despite their best efforts, the Germans could not replicate the same level of defensive firepower that the B-17 offered. The effectiveness of the bomber's defense left the Luftwaffe with no choice but to adapt their tactics. After the experience of flying the captured B-17, many Luftwaffe officers came away with a deep respect for the aircraft's capabilities. They were amazed by the B-17's ability to defend itself and its crew. The idea of a bomber that could fight back was revolutionary, and it quickly became clear to the Luftwaffe that the Allies had found a new way to level the playing field in the air. The B-17's combination of armament, durability, and the expertise of its crew made it a force to be reckoned with in the skies over Europe. As the war progressed, the Luftwaffe began to refine its own tactics in response to the challenges posed by the B-17. One such tactic was to employ larger numbers of fighters in coordinated attacks, trying to overwhelm the bomber formations with sheer weight of numbers. However, even this approach had limited success, as the B-17s continued to prove resilient in the face of adversity. The Luftwaffe's attempts to develop bombers with similar defensive capabilities, such as the Heinkel He-177, were largely unsuccessful. The He-177 was plagued by design flaws that made it less effective in combat, and it never achieved the level of success that the B-17 had on the Allied side. The realization that the B-17 had changed the dynamics of aerial combat prompted a shift in the Luftwaffe's approach to air superiority. The German fighters, which had once been so dominant, now had to contend with the B-17's defensive capabilities, forcing the Luftwaffe to come up with new ways to deal with this formidable adversary. Ultimately, the introduction of the B-17 was a game changer in the air war over Europe. It demonstrated the effectiveness of a new kind of bomber, one that could not only deliver devastating payloads, but also defend itself against enemy attacks. This shift in the balance of power in the skies would have a lasting impact on the course of World War II. The B-17's influence extended beyond the immediate impact on Luftwaffe tactics. It also marked a shift in the way the Allied forces approached strategic bombing. Prior to the B-17, bombers had been largely vulnerable to enemy fighters, requiring costly fighter escorts for protection. The B-17 changed this calculus by allowing bombers to fend for themselves, thereby reducing the need for constant fighter support. This had significant logistical and tactical implications, as it meant that larger bombing formations could be sent deeper into enemy territory, with less reliance on escorts, increasing the effectiveness of the Allied bombing campaign. In the years after the war, the legacy of the B-17 would continue to influence the development of future bombers and military aviation strategies. Its ability to defend itself in combat, its resilience in the face of damage, and its role in shaping the tactics of the Luftwaffe would serve as important lessons for future generations of airmen and military strategists. The B-17 Flying Fortress would go down in history as one of the most influential aircraft of World War II, not just for its ability to carry out bombing missions, but for the way it revolutionized the concept of defensive firepower in air combat. The B-17 Flying Fortress didn't just change the tactical landscape for the Luftwaffe. It also had a profound impact on the morale and strategic planning of both the Allies and the Axis forces. The concept behind the B-17 was not only to create a heavily armed bomber capable of defending itself, but also to instill a sense of invulnerability in the crews flying them. The B-17 was designed to be a formidable adversary, one that could survive in hostile airspace and deliver devastating payloads, even when faced with overwhelming odds. For the Allies, the B-17 represented a shift in the way bombers were perceived. Before its introduction, bombers were generally seen as vulnerable, slow-moving targets that required extensive fighter escort to reach their targets. The B-17, with its ability to defend itself effectively, changed this dynamic. It was no longer just a bomber. It was an air combat weapon in its own right. The aircraft's firepower allowed it to fly deep into enemy territory, striking at the heart of Nazi Germany's industrial and military infrastructure without relying as heavily on fighter protection. This ability to fly without constant escort was a game changer for Allied bombing strategy. From a strategic perspective, the B-17 allowed the Allies to execute more aggressive and sustained bombing campaigns. The increased reliance on bomber formations meant that aircrews could maintain constant pressure on German cities, factories, and military targets. The B-17 could stay in the fight longer, return to base after sustaining heavy damage, and, most importantly, continue to deliver bombs that would cripple the Axis war machine. The psychological effect of seeing a fleet of B-17s, each one bristling with firepower and capable of defending itself, boosted Allied morale and instilled a sense of optimism about the eventual outcome of the war. The B-17's defensive firepower also changed the way strategic bombing was conducted. Instead of relying on large formations of fighters to escort bombers and protect them from enemy interceptors, the B-17 allowed for the creation of bomber formations that could defend themselves. This shift in strategy had a ripple effect on how the Allies structured their bombing raids. The American 8th Air Force, in particular, was able to mount massive bombing campaigns against German industry and military targets without the need for overwhelming fighter escorts, although fighters were still used for added protection. However, the B-17's success also meant that the Luftwaffe had to rethink its approach to attacking Allied bombers. German pilots, who were once accustomed to picking off bombers with ease, now faced a much more formidable foe. Initially, the Luftwaffe relied on speed and maneuverability to dive into bomber formations, firing their weapons and then quickly pulling out. However, this tactic proved ineffective against the B-17. The bomber's extensive armament and defensive firepower made such tactics too dangerous, and German pilots soon found that a direct assault on a B-17 was likely to result in heavy losses. This forced the Luftwaffe to develop new tactics. One such tactic was the use of larger, coordinated fighter formations. German fighters would now attempt to swarm bomber formations, hoping to overwhelm their defenses with numbers. Despite the German airmen's exceptional skills, the sheer defensive power of the B-17 made it incredibly difficult to execute such attacks successfully. The bombers' tight formations and its ability to return fire from multiple positions made it extremely difficult to penetrate, even with superior numbers. The shift in tactics, however, was not enough to stop the B-17's success. The bomber was able to maintain its momentum, and despite suffering significant losses, it continued to make a devastating impact on German cities and factories. The Germans, who had once enjoyed air superiority, now found themselves on the defensive in the skies. They had no equivalent aircraft to match the B-17's combination of firepower, range, and durability. The Luftwaffe's inability to effectively counter the B-17 meant that the Allies were able to carry out their bombing campaigns with increasing success. The psychological effect of the B-17 on the Luftwaffe pilots cannot be overstated. For many German pilots, the sight of a large formation of B-17s would have been a daunting one. These bombers, which had initially been thought of as easy prey, had now become a symbol of Allied resolve and technological superiority. The German pilots who faced these bombers in combat often spoke of the difficulty of attacking them and the heavy losses they sustained in doing so. The B-17's presence in the skies over Europe served as a reminder of the growing might of the Allied forces and the shifting balance of power. On the Allied side, the B-17 became a symbol of American innovation and military strength. Its effectiveness in the field boosted the confidence of the U.S. Army Air Forces and inspired further advancements in bomber technology. As the war progressed, the B-17 would be joined by other bombers, such as the B-24 Liberator and the B-29 Superfortress, each of which would build on the lessons learned from the B-17's success. These bombers would carry the torch of strategic bombing forward, but the B-17 would always be remembered as the first true, flying fortress that could defend itself and deliver a crushing blow to the enemy. Moreover, the B-17's impact wasn't confined to the strategic bombing campaigns over Europe. Its design influenced the development of bombers in other theaters of war. The lessons learned from the B-17 would shape the development of long-range bombers used in the Pacific theater, such as the B-29, which would go on to play a pivotal role in the defeat of Japan. The B-17's ability to sustain damage, protect its crew, and carry out long-range bombing missions would inform the design of future bombers, solidifying its legacy as one of the most influential aircraft in military aviation history. In terms of legacy, the B-17 also helped change the perception of bombers in general. The idea that a bomber could be heavily armed and capable of defending itself was revolutionary. It established a new standard for bomber design, one that would continue to evolve throughout the war and beyond. The B-17 was a precursor to the next generation of bombers that would become even more advanced, with better weapons, more durable designs, and greater payload capacities. But the B-17's impact wasn't purely military. It became an enduring symbol of the war effort, representing not just technological advancement, but also the resolve and determination of the Allied forces. Its role in the bombing campaigns over Europe helped bring the war to a quicker end, hastening the defeat of Nazi Germany. The crews that flew the B-17 often faced extreme peril, and their courage in the face of overwhelming odds was a testament to the strength of the Allied resolve. In retrospect, the Luftwaffe's underestimation of the B-17's defensive capabilities can be seen as one of the key miscalculations of the air war over Europe. The Germans had believed that their fighter planes would have little trouble overwhelming Allied bombers. However, the B-17's combination of firepower, durability, and effective crew coordination forced the Luftwaffe to abandon this assumption. The B-17's ability to defend itself against even the best trained Luftwaffe pilots demonstrated the growing power of Allied aviation and was a key factor in the eventual victory over Germany. In the end, the B-17 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of the transformation of air combat during World War II. It was the first true flying fortress, and it changed the way bombers were designed and used in warfare. It not only influenced the course of the war, but also shaped the future of military aviation. The B-17 Flying Fortress would go down in history as one of the most iconic and impactful aircraft of the 20th century. The technological and tactical innovations introduced by the B-17 Flying Fortress had long-lasting effects on both Allied and Axis air forces during World War II. The B-17 was a key player in the strategic bombing campaigns of the Allies, particularly in the European theater, where it played a pivotal role in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The impact of the B-17 was not just limited to its firepower or defensive capabilities. It also influenced the strategic mindset of the Allied forces and the way they approached aerial warfare. Before the introduction of the B-17, strategic bombing was largely considered a risky venture. Bombers had typically been slow and vulnerable to enemy fighters, and their missions required the protection of fighter escorts. The B-17 changed this calculus by being designed from the ground up with the idea of self-defense in mind. The aircraft's armament, 13 .50 caliber machine guns strategically placed around the aircraft, provided a level of protection that was unprecedented in bomber design. This defensive firepower allowed the B-17 to operate without relying as heavily on fighter escorts, which had been a logistical and strategic challenge for the Allies during the early years of the war. The B-17's defensive capabilities allowed it to fly deeper into enemy territory, striking at key strategic targets with far less risk of being intercepted or shot down. This was especially important in the bombing raids against Germany's industrial base, which were crucial to crippling the Nazi war machine. By targeting factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs, the B-17s played a critical role in disrupting Germany's ability to wage war. The bomber's ability to defend itself, even when surrounded by enemy fighters, made it an invaluable tool in the Allied air strategy. In contrast, German bombers like the Heinkel He-111 and Junkers Ju-88, while effective in their own right, did not have the same level of self-defense capability as the B-17. German bombers relied more heavily on fighter escorts for protection, and this left them vulnerable during the early stages of the war, when the Luftwaffe's fighter aircraft were not always available in sufficient numbers. The B-17's ability to defend itself and maintain its offensive capability without relying on escorts shifted the balance of power in the skies. The Germans had no bomber that could match the B-17's combination of range, firepower, and durability, which made the Allies' strategic bombing campaigns more effective. The B-17's influence went beyond just its tactical use in combat. The aircraft represented a paradigm shift in the way air forces thought about the role of bombers in warfare. Before the B-17, bombers were often seen as vulnerable and were used primarily in night raids or with heavy fighter support. The B-17, however, demonstrated that bombers could fly in daylight and be just as capable of defending themselves as any fighter. This shift in mindset led to a rethinking of how bombing campaigns were structured. Instead of relying on large fighter escorts to protect bombers, Allied forces began to focus on bomber formations, where each bomber's defensive firepower would support the others. The introduction of the B-17 also marked a turning point in the use of bombers as a primary tool for strategic warfare. The idea of using bombers to destroy an enemy's infrastructure, rather than simply targeting military units, was a relatively new concept in the early stages of World War II. The B-17's success in executing precision bombing raids against key industrial targets showed that it was possible to wage war on an industrial scale, weakening an enemy's economy in war, making capabilities without having to engage in large-scale ground battles. This approach to warfare would continue to evolve throughout the war, with bombers becoming an integral part of Allied strategy. The B-17's effectiveness in the war was not just due to its technological advancements, but also to the skill and bravery of the aircrews who flew it. The crews underwent rigorous training to operate the aircraft's complex systems and weapons, and their ability to coordinate their efforts during missions was crucial to the bomber's success. The crew members operated the bomber's guns in unison, creating a network of fire that could deter enemy fighters from getting too close. The coordination of the crew's defensive efforts, along with their ability to stay focused under pressure, was a critical factor in the bomber's effectiveness. As the war progressed, the B-17 became a symbol of the Allied effort to defeat Nazi Germany. The bomber's ability to sustain damage and return to base became legendary, with many crews and aircraft returning home despite suffering extensive damage. These stories of resilience helped boost the morale of both the crews who flew the B-17s and the civilians who supported the war effort. The B-17 was more than just a tool of war. It became a symbol of endurance, teamwork, and the determination to overcome adversity. The psychological impact of the B-17 on the Luftwaffe was also significant. German pilots, who had initially underestimated the bomber's capabilities, were forced to reconsider their tactics. They were accustomed to engaging bombers that were vulnerable to their attacks, but the B-17's defensive firepower made this approach far more dangerous. As a result, the Luftwaffe had to adapt by using larger, more coordinated formations of fighters to attempt to overwhelm the bombers. However, this strategy was not always successful, as the B-17's formation tactics and defensive firepower made it difficult to single out individual bombers for attack. The Luftwaffe's struggle to counter the B-17 highlighted the growing technological gap between the two air forces. The Germans had some of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, but they lacked a bomber that could match the B-17's capabilities. The German inability to develop a comparable bomber meant that the Allies had a significant advantage in the air war. This technological disparity would continue to widen as the war progressed, with the Allies introducing more advanced bombers and fighters, further strengthening their air superiority. The B-17's role in the war was not just limited to its offensive capabilities. Its introduction and success marked the beginning of a new era in aviation, where bombers were no longer seen as simple targets to be protected by fighters. The B-17 demonstrated that bombers could be just as capable of defending themselves as any fighter, and this shifted the way air forces thought about the role of bombers in military strategy. The B-17 also influenced the development of other bombers, such as the B-24 Liberator and the B-29 Superfortress, which built upon the lessons learned from the B-17's design. Beyond the battlefield, the B-17 became a symbol of American innovation and industrial might. The aircraft was produced in large numbers, with over 12,000 units built during the war. The production of the B-17 helped fuel the American war economy and provided thousands of jobs for workers in factories across the United States. The bomber became a symbol of the United States' commitment to defeating the Axis powers, and its success in the war helped solidify the country's position as a global superpower in the post-war years. The B-17's legacy extends far beyond World War II. It influenced the development of modern bomber designs and played a significant role in shaping the future of military aviation. Its combination of firepower, range, and durability set a new standard for bombers and paved the way for the development of even more advanced aircraft in the years following the war. The lessons learned from the B-17's success continue to shape air warfare strategies and aircraft design to this day. In conclusion, the B-17 Flying Fortress was a groundbreaking aircraft that changed the nature of aerial warfare. Its technological innovations, defensive capabilities, and strategic impact helped shift the balance of power in the skies during World War II. The B-17's success in combat, its ability to defend itself against enemy fighters, and its role in the Allied bombing campaigns were key factors in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The bomber's legacy continues to influence military aviation and stands as a testament to the ingenuity and determination of those who designed, built, and flew it.